Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I am your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today we have a very special guest. We're going to be joined by Dr. James Agnew to talk about his new book, The Devil's Disbarment: Exploring Christ's Victory in the Divine Council. So I will put a link in the description below if you would like to pick it up. And thank you so much, Dr. James, for coming on. Let's get into it. Dr. James, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. This is a lot of fun. I've been watching your channel for a long time, which, by the way, everyone, I'll put a link to his YouTube channel as well down below. He's got a lot of great content there. And just when I first found you, I started binging your content. It was it was one of those moments where you find someone, you're like, oh, I like the way this guy thinks, and I just started watching all your videos. So really recommend his stuff. For anyone that's unaware of who you are, what you do, could you explain a little bit about yourself? Catch them up to speed.
Yeah, so I'm in philosopher's garb, and I'm just another dishonest TikTok apologist out here, just twisting things. So I say that's kind of like my go-to joke now. So I started an online presence, I guess a couple years ago now, mainly focusing actually on TikTok, putting up short form content, responding to crazy stuff on TikTok, and then when I did that, I also started a YouTube, and I put out a lot of stuff. For a while, I mainly focused on like what you would call defending mere Christianity, so mainly like apologetics type stuff, God's existence, problem of evil, biblical, resurrection of Jesus, stuff like that. Biblical reliability, gospel authorship. Although recently, if you look at my YouTube channel now, you'll see it's a lot of just theology stuff.
Mhm.
So that's not that's not too surprising considering I recently finished a doctorate in theology. I did a dissertation focusing on defending what's called kenotic Christology. I have a separate book about that. And so yeah, I'm interested. While I was working on that dissertation for kenotic Christology, I stumbled upon things that got me thinking about atonement and kind of flipped my world upside down in some ways and maybe be like, oh, I need to rethink some things. And then so this book that we're talking about today, The Devil's Disbarment, this is something I kind of wrote on the side of finishing up my doctoral program and getting the, stuff ironed out of my dissertation. So I'm glad that it wasn't just a complete waste of time and that people are finding it interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really did. And that's really cool that your doctorate is on canonic theology. So, maybe for those that don't know what that is, would you like to give a brief description for those that might be interested in your other book too?
Yeah, so kenotic Christology is the idea that when Jesus becomes incarnate, he empties himself of something. He empties himself, and there's different ways it gets cashed out, throughout history. But it's the idea that Christ empties himself of some knowledge or some power or use of knowledge or power. Something like I said, there's different ways to cash it out, but there's some type of emptying. The word kenotic comes from a Greek word for kenosis, to mean emptying. We see this in the Philippian hymns when it says, Christ emptied himself, becoming a man. So what I do in that dissertation is one of the kind of big objections to this approach to the incarnation is, well, if Jesus gave up any power or he gave up any knowledge, and it means he's not omnipotent anymore. That means he's not omniscient, but that means he's not God. I call this the kind of the essential attributes objection. And the point of my dissertation was to argue that that objection is not successful. There's at least two ways to get around that. Actually, probably more like two or three. But what I propose in my thing is kind of two newish pathways to kind of get around that, incorporating work that came before me. So that was the focus of my dissertation.
That's really, really cool. And I'm trying to think about, like Chalcedonian Christianity, like the fully God, fully man. And, for him to be fully man, it would seem like there needs to be some sort of emptying because it's like, I'm not omnipresent or omniscient or anything like that. And I'm a human. So it seems like he needs to, as Hebrews says, like be like me in every respect. So, I wonder if that's maybe one of the verses you go to, but
That I do go to that verse. Yeah. So the
yeah.
actually Hebrews, him becoming like us in all respects, that is one of the key things that led me going down this atonement route. So I will say the idea, like, okay, if Christ didn't empty himself, then he's not man. That's a big kind of argument or line of thought in certain proponents of kind of Christology. I don't make that argument so much. My argument is more, if he didn't become like us in all respects, he couldn't save us, because that seems to be the idea of Hebrews. But yeah, getting into Hebrews and that verse that you referenced and those ideas with my dissertation kind of required me to think like, okay, I need to understand like sacrifices and priesthood and like what is it a priest really does in the Old Testament and like how is Christ doing that, and then so yeah, that was a big thing for both books. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll definitely maybe have to do another conversation about your canonic theology book. That sounds really interesting. But what's interesting about this book, about the Devil's Disbarment and Atonement, is that your view takes the divine counsel into account, and this is very unique. I've never heard a atonement theory bring in the divine counsels. First of all, there's probably a lot of people that don't even know what the divine counsel is. I actually did a poll on my YouTube or on my X account recently,
Mhm.
where I asked my audience, do you think the divine counsel theory is true? And I put yes, no, and then I put a third option saying, what is that? And that
Mhm.
option actually got the most votes. And so it's not a very common view that people know about. So I was wanting to ask, like, before we even get into atonement, what is the divine counsel, and what are some of the verses that you look to kind of prop up that idea?
Yeah, so the divine counsel, put simply, is that God has an entourage, right? I think that maybe is like how Heiser depicts it. So let's think about a human king, right? Fantasy kingdom, whatever, pick your fantasy kingdom of choice, or medieval kingdom of choice. You've got a king, right? He's the ruler. He's sitting up on the throne. He has advisors around. He has people around him. We'll just say that he has people around him who he talks with and plans with, and they're kind of they kind of are around him in some sense, and he delegates responsibility to them, right? So even, for instance, even I'm a U.S. citizen. Even in the presidential system of the U.S., there are like cabinet members and stuff like that. That's kind of like a presidential council in some ways, at least roughly speaking. And the idea of the divine council is that God's the king, right? God also has this kind of council. He kind of has people who stand or around him and are a part of his decision making, and he gives real authority to them. And so one of the kind of go-to text illustrating this is going to be First Kings 22. So this is a very small section. I'll read maybe something from this, and then I'll tack on a small thing from Daniel, just to get the idea of the divine counsel in Scripture. So this is First Kings 22. I think this is verses 19 through 23. I think I'm going to read here from the ESV. So Micaiah said, "Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. And then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." Okay, so let's break down this verse kind of really quickly and briefly. So this is Micaiah, the prophet. He's telling about something that he saw this vision of the divine council, and in it we see God, right? We see the Lord. He's sitting on his throne, high and lifted up, so on and so forth. And the host of heaven. This is a term that's used to refer to these angelic beings a lot of times in the what we often refer to as angelic beings. Maybe you would want to nitpick with the word angel there, but we see the heavenly beings surrounding him on his right hand, his left. And the Lord asked them a question. He says, what's the game plan, right? What's the game plan, guys? Who's going to go up and entice?" And then so what we see is there's some discussion amongst the members of the heavenly host that are around them. One says one thing, one says another, and then this particular spirit comes forward, says, "Hey, I'll do this," and God says, "Yeah, that's the plan. Let's do that." And so we see here the idea of God. He has his counsel. He gives decisions, or he delegates or invites his counsel to participate in the decisions that he's going to make. In this one, he approves it. But yeah, so we get that idea there. Now, one other instance where we get this idea of kind of um, delegation to these heavenly beings is going to be Daniel 4:13 through 17. So this says, "I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said, Thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit." I'm going to skip a little bit here because this is just the vision. And then we get down to verse 17. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So the idea here is, I believe, if I remember correctly, this is Nebuchadnezzar talking in this passage, and he's describing this, a vision, this dream he has, and the being who comes to him is a watcher. That's a word that I won't get super into that here, but that's a word at least used to refer to some type of celestial being in the ancient Near East, a holy one, and they come down from heaven. So this is some type of heavenly being. They come down and they give this proclamation about, what is about to happen. And then they finish this by saying that this sentence, it comes from the decree of the watchers. The decision is by the word of the holy ones, plural, right? So the idea there is the watchers are making this decision. They are the ones who are decreeing this to him. And of course, this is done so that they may, have this knowledge about the Most High, right? It's not that it's, in some sense, detached from what the Most High wants. It's so that those on earth, may ultimately come to know him, so on and so forth. But so I point out this verse because this is an instance in which we see these members of the divine council, these holy ones, they were given real authority. And of course, there's other sections in scripture we could go to about, in Daniel 7, the idea of, authority being taken away from one beast and given to the Son of Man that pops up. The beast having authority is something that pops up in Revelation as well. But yeah, I'll stop there and say that's the general idea of the divine council. God, he's in heaven. He has an entourage around him of, whatever you want to call it, holy ones, advisors, high-ranking officials, and he invites them to participate, and they have roles in the governing of creation.
Hmm. When I first heard about the divine council, I remember being a little bit weary of it or hesitant. It's like not something you heard of before. Traditionally, when you think of God, especially because I grew up in like an evangelical background, um, the idea of God is kind of he decrees all things. He's providentially going over all things, and for him to have like an entourage of people and he's talking about it, even though in the divine council view, Yahweh would be like the head of it and the one who makes all the final decisions. And I would assume, the Elohim, that's like the Hebrew word for the holy ones. They can't make a decision apart from what Yahweh says, right? Would that kind of be the idea? Or are they
Um,
able to do their own thing?
so, so my answer to this is gonna, maybe get us into some of the other questions. So the idea that I kind of bring up in my book is that there are Elohim who are, they rebel. Like, so they go against God. So this is very similar to an idea called like the Great Controversy theology. And the idea that, and I articulate this in this book, and I kind of bring this out, and I think it's chapter 5. Why did the
Mm,
gods have authority? So there's an idea here that God delegates authority to some of these beings, but they do things that God doesn't like. And so, a good
yeah.
example of this would be something like, Psalm 82, right? So God takes his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then he just starts roasting them, right? Like, how long will you judge unjustly and show
Mm,
partiality to the wicked, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, so on and so forth. He says, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you, nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. And if you think, oh, wait, but hey, that's about human rulers. No, it's not. I have a video about that. I have a section of my book about that. I won't get into that here. There's really no good case to be made that this is human rulers, and there's like a lot of evidence that this is heavenly beings. And so yeah, so there are decisions that can get made by these by these beings that have been given this type of authority, which God is not a fan of. And now, if you have the question of like, oh, like why does he give them authority if he's not a fan of the decisions? That's an idea I get into the book, and if you want to, we can talk about that as well. But I would say that these people can go in directions God's like, that's not it. No.
yeah. So they have free will. And
Hmm.
that's it. And I think that is something that, human beings we can relate to, right? He gives us the ability to do horrendously evil things, and people do horrendously evil things. But God, in his infinite goodness, is still just in allowing that to take place, whether you take a greater goods theodicy or whatever other kind of answer you have. You actually give a really interesting answer in the last chapter. We won't get into that now, but I think that your answer on the problem of evil was really interesting there too. So, okay, we have this divine council. So maybe someone's listening right now, and you were like me when you first heard of it. You're like weary. You're like, I don't know about this whole idea of the divine council. Let's just talk about the fact he gave a couple of scriptures and shows that there's this entourage around God. Let's take a moment and accept it for the sake of argument. Let's just say it's true for a moment. And now let's talk about how this can play a part in the atonement, because I think if you will entertain this idea for a moment, you'll think that this is probably the coolest view of atonement that's out there, at least that I've heard. So first, what is the purpose of this divine council? Like what is the reason that God, I guess, has this entourage to talk and do things with?
Yeah, okay. So why does God set up a divine council? So this is a question I talk about in my book. I think it's chapter 5 and then the last chapter. So I kind of start from square one and I develop this idea. It's like, okay, like God's creating, he wants to have beings who engage in this type of relationship with him. What type of world does God want? And I think that God wants a world in which his creation shares in has significant responsibility in some way and shares in kind of the governance of creation with him. Now I give about like I think I give maybe three or so reasons in my book for why God might want this, and I give some thought experiments to summarize. One, it's something that would be good for us and give us joy, like to participate in this type of like to have this type of responsibility and significance in creation. I think it's something that brings us joy. I think it's something that brings God joy. Like God's getting to do this stuff with his, like he's getting to create and in some sense govern this like beautiful creation like with us. Like we get to participate with him. I think the idea that one of the analogies I give in my book is like God's not a musician who's just like sitting up on stage playing and like he wants us to sit in the audience and be like, oh yes, very nice. Like he wants us to get up and contribute like our own beats and melodies. And I did an interview with I did a video with Mike Jones of Inspiring Philosophy once, and I had like a big extended chunk where I actually drew on the Silmarillion by Tolkien and how Iluvatar is depicted as singing and inviting the other beings in that story to contribute to the song. I think it's something like that. So anyways, so God wants his creation to have significant responsibility, authority, and stuff like that. And the part of doing that, if God gives us this type of responsibility and he gives us this type of freedom, something that's going to come about as a result of that seems very likely is that there may be times in which we make a decision and it's not wise for God to immediately overrule it. And so I give the example in my book of something like, let's say I'm a dad and I've got the family business. Just picture me like with an old man beard or something like that. I'm an old man and and I've got like a son and he's coming of age and I'm like, all right, I want him to be part of the family business. And I say, son, I want you to, govern this business with me. And I'm going to give you're going to be the head of like the, I don't know, XYZ department, right? And so you're going to be in charge of this. You're going to have, responsibility and make decisions. And to kind of usher in your new position here, I'm also going to delegate like $50,000 worth of funds to improving the company however you see fit. Come, my son, let us do this together, right? And then so let's say the son, he's like, yeah, okay, let's do it. And so he does some research and he's like, okay, I've noticed there's this section of the market that we're just like, I don't know, we're not tapping into. So I want to take the 50,000, invest it into R&D and see about, broadening our market appeal into this section of, I don't know, widgets or gadgets or whatever it is we're making that, are going to be applicable. If I say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that, I think that's dumb. He's like, oh, so okay. So next idea. Okay. Maybe the son comes to me and he's like, okay, I've noticed that the machines we use in our factory, they're not as efficient as they could be, and we could make them more efficient. And so he's like, I want to take this 50,000, use it to kind of improve our machinery. This is going to cut costs. Boom. And I say, yeah, I don't like that idea either. No, we're not going to do that. Son's like, okay. Okay, like office chairs in the corporate office, they're garbage, right? So let's just replace all the corporate office chairs. They're like got like stuffing coming out. They're like smelly. Like we're going to replace all those with like brand new navy blue office chairs. I think about it for a second. I say, okay, tell you what, you can do that, but they have to be black, not navy blue. I'm not a big fan of navy blue. At that point, like, is the son gonna feel like he had any like responsibility? Is the son gonna feel like I really gave him responsibility and really invited him into doing this with me? Like, no. Like, what began as an honor, like this, like this exalting of him in some sense, really becomes an insult. It really becomes, petty. And so, in that scenario, even if I knew that like this 50,000 we were gonna, put into R&D for something, even if I knew that that wasn't gonna turn out well, if I want this end, like if the reason I invited my son to like do this stuff with me was because I wanted this type of relationship with him, I wanted to get to this end goal. even if I know that that's not going to work well, me just shooting it down immediately, that may be counterproductive to this end goal. I may need to let the son, like kind of do some things, learn and stuff like that. But what I can do is I can give advice and I can counsel, but ultimately, leave it up to him. And so I kind of, draw out the idea of, the way that God needs to interact with beings who he's giving this type of responsibility to. He needs to be very careful. He's kind of playing this delicate game because at the same time, he doesn't want to just go hands off and be like, all right, you want to burn down the corporate office? Like, go for it. I said you were in charge. Like, no, we like shouldn't be that hands off, right? Like, it seems like wrong, seems problematic. Um, and so, kind of one of the so he has this kind of delicate game that he's going to play. And one of the ideas that I postulate when it comes to, this corporate scenario, imagine there that I invite the son to participate in governance with me. And I also say to him, hey, just so you know, I don't make all the decisions here. We have a board of trustees. I'm the chair of the board, so I'm like the top dog of the board. But we have a chair of, trustees or board members or whatever, and all decisions for how funds are spent or, XYZ, all these go through them. You have to get approval through the board. And so this is other, shareholders or members or whatever getting to participate, right? So now if he comes and he puts up an idea and it's bad, and the board members are like, this is bad, and he gets shut down, like it's not me, like I'm not the one doing it. It isn't just like, oh, dad, you did this. Like, hey, listen, I go through the board as well. So there's almost like this buffer here of this could be a potentially interesting way for that dad, me in the scenario. I'm not a dad, I'm just using this epithet. Remember, old man beard. This would be a hypothetical way for him to to kind of navigate that situation. So that's an idea. All right, keep that in your mind. But then I have this other idea that I play with, and again, this comes up in great controversy, thought, and stuff like that. So imagine you're God, and you've created these beings, and you're inviting them to go in creation with you, contribute their own beats and melodies, and for the most part, it's going pretty great, right? You're dishing out some advice here. Sometimes they take it, sometimes they don't, but they're learning, and they're like, okay, like for God, like things are going pretty well, right? Like you're starting to build this relationship. But then you have this one being, and I call him, I think, like the cosmic malcontent or something like that. Like he's just a jerk. Like he gets like he just bristles every time you correct him. Even if you're right, even if he's wrong, even if you're being gentle, he just keeps bristling. Like he just becomes so inflated with pride and so full of himself that he starts to be the one who wants to be the one who makes all the executive decisions. He wants to be the one who makes all he is the one giving the advice and steering the ship, so to speak. He doesn't want to just, put little frills on creation. He wants to, like, broad share, do it. And so this guy, this cosmic malcontent, he starts going around and he starts sowing seeds of doubt. He starts sowing seeds of mutiny amongst the other beings. He says, "Oh, this God guy doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, this is what he told me, but like this is obviously wrong." So he starts sowing the seeds of doubt, all right, amongst the kind of cosmic beings. Now, you're God. What you gonna do? Because if you're just like, oh, this guy, he's saying all these things, and maybe it's even sounding plausible to the other beings, like, how are you going to defeat that? Are you going to just kill him? Because that doesn't seem like it's going to work. I mean, like, okay, I'm God, I killed a being. Does that really clear my name? Like, if I'm a sitting president and a journalist is accusing me of corruption, if I just killed the journalist, if I cleared my name, is that a good way to instill confidence in my governing abilities and my, like, integrity? Like, no, no, right? And so, if God is being accused in this type of way, it seems like it isn't just about how do I shut this being up. It's how do I refute the kind of epistemic seeds? How do I correct the false teaching that this being has sown in my creation? How do I do that in such a way that doesn't lose track of the original goal that I had, which is to enter into this type of relationship with these beings? Because if I can show that this guy is false and he doesn't know what he's talking about, then the beings who are watching, they can be like, oh, God is smart, God is good, all those type of
Mhm.
things. And so I give an example of this in Job, right? Job's like, God, you're whack. You know what you're talking about with Job. And God's like, oh really? Like, let's try it then. Let's see who's right about Job's character. Um, and so the reason I say all this is because if this type of counsel, if this is kind of like a court hearing, in which cases are being tried. Like one side is getting to present their case and another side is getting to present their case. God allows this because God's wanting to convince the council. God's wanting to convince those in heaven who have heard the accusations against him, the accusations against us, so on and so forth. So there's a couple different ways you could flesh it out. You could be like, this is just a really good way in general for God to set up governing things, is to do it in this type of, like hierarchical way, like I did with, the widget gadget factory or whatever it is I said with me and my hypothetical son. You could do something like that outside of this kind of cosmic controversy concept, or you could pull it in and say, "Hey, listen, this divine council thing, this serves a really good, interesting function in this type of controversy in which God is trying to convince people, and we're kind of he kind of has everyone around who's participating in this controversy, where people get to maybe have some say in making sure if there are rules of engagement that are followed. So, for instance, when God interacts with Job, he doesn't give just Satan like, yeah, do whatever you want. He says, okay, you have to, not do this, not do this. There's rules of engagement that are agreed upon by both parties. And so, anyways, yeah, I've been yapping for a little bit. I'll pause there, and you're welcome to, poke and prod as you see fit.
No, that was really interesting. So the purpose of the divine council is because God wants to enter into relationships. He's a relational God, and he not only wants to create embodied beings like us, but he also wants to create spiritual beings where he's in relationship, because that's just the kind of God he is, as being love. And so then you're given this analogy that I think flows perfectly into the next question, because the next question is, well, how does this divine council theory play into our atonement? How does what Jesus do on the cross play into this idea of the divine court case? You were talking about the great malcontent, I think is what you said, or something like this. That so that's obviously going to be Satan. So he's accusing us. He's trying to make this case against us. So how does what Jesus did on the cross solve this problem that Satan has brought up?
Yeah, so tell you what, I will what I'll do is I'll step back and I'll kind of I'm gonna try to contextualize my despair when I was trying to figure out the atonement, right? So I'm gonna maybe get people to see this through my eyes for a second, right? It'll take a little bit longer, but hopefully it'll be fun. So go on. Okay.
Sure.
So I came out atonement from a penal substitution background, right? And then, long story short, I was like, that doesn't fit the data. So we should want a model of, or an understanding of the atonement that fits all the biblical data. So some of the biblical data that we have is Jesus died, and that was significant, and that somehow helped us. So we got like Jesus's death is like on the table of things that need to be explained and accounted for. And in addition to that, we have this whole idea of like Satan and the cosmic baddies, as I will call them, right? You have like Satan and these demons or cosmic baddies, and they are in some sense we are subjected to slavery to them. We are under their power, like they need to be defeated, kind of Christus Victor type stuff. So you've got those type of things, okay? But then also you have this language in Hebrews about the reason we're able to be saved. Actually, in Hebrews and in Romans, about this idea that the reason we're able to be saved is because stuff that goes on after the resurrection. Like this idea that after the resurrection, after Jesus dies, he's doing this stuff in heaven, like he's being our high priest, and that's why we're able to be saved. So it's like, okay, so like, okay, so it's now already like this stuff is getting complicated, because like I have to figure out how Satan is defeated. I have to do this in a way that incorporates Jesus's death, but I also have to do it in a way that like puts the main focus on what Jesus does like after the resurrection from the dead and like stuff he's doing in heaven. But then here's like the final thing is like you have to do all that while taking into account the idea of Jesus being a sacrifice and a high priest, and you have to do that in a way that is at least somewhat, in continuity with how those ideas are depicted in the Old Testament. And I encourage you to pause, the video for like 5 minutes and think about, if I'm going to try to create a schema, a story that encapsulates all those things, how am I going to do that? And this is what I was wrestling with, is like, so sometimes when it comes to atonement theology, you have people who are like, they have all these things and they'll take one and they'll be like, this is the main thing. And then they'll just like build their story out of that and like not include the other stuff. Like that's really easy, but it's just not intellectually satisfying. And that's something I encountered when I would, I'd be reading some work by like a Christus Victor advocate. I'd be like, okay, yeah, I like a lot. You're really accounting for this, Satan and the cosmic baddies being defeated. But like, what about all the stuff that Jesus is supposed to be doing after like his death? Like, you haven't accounted for that. You haven't told me what it means for Jesus to be my high priest. You haven't, factored in him as, like this Levitical type of sacrifice. Like all that stuff was left out. And then you have other people who like they'll do a lot of stuff maybe with that. But then I'm like, okay, but like you're not telling me anything about like Satan and the cosmic body. So like it gets really difficult to connect all these things. And one of the ways that someone might approach this is to just kind of be like, like, it's a mosaic. There's a bunch of different images. There's a bunch of, different pictures. And all these things come together to give us, like the picture of the atonement. And that sounds great. Like if you don't think about it too much, but like, so there's a book and I think it's called Mosaic of the Atonement. And like, there's a lot of great stuff in that book. And I used it in my research, but I'm like, this doesn't feel like a mosaic. This doesn't feel like a mosaic, and like this feels like a Frankenstein's monster, where you just took a bunch of appendages and just like mutilated them together. And what I have is just like this giant incoherent ball of flesh. Like it isn't giving me like this really great picture of the atonement. So it's like I need something more than that. I need you more than just giving me like this hypothetical like statue in which this is the head and this is the body. Like I need a story that incorporates it all. And then you have like the kaleidoscope approach, which is just straightforward, like, it's like a kaleidoscope. These are all different images. So I found all these, dissatisfying. And one of my professors, so I was working on my dissertation, and one of my professors, like, he knew I was working on this stuff, and he was chatting with me about all this. And he said something along the lines like, oh, it may be that these different images, like, these are doing different things. And that's an idea I played with. And there were times when I was trying to figure this out where I was wrestling with how do I make these come together? And I felt like I just wasn't going to be able to do it. I was just like, whatever, like this is hopeless, right? And there were times when I looked at like the escape hatch of just like, whatever, kaleidoscope approach, whatever, these are just all different images for different things. But there was this tiny, so here I'm bringing it home, right? There was this tiny little thread, right? And if in the ocean and the raging sea of different biblical atonement motifs, I had this one little like thread that I was hanging onto that like seemed like it was promising to like tie them all together. And that's the idea of the divine council and the idea of advocacy and accusation in heaven. Okay, so like now we're bringing back. I'm going to answer your question that maybe people have felt my pain a little bit. So in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, there's this theme that divine counsel that we've been talking about, that there is accusation in it and there's advocacy. And let me give two examples from the Old Testament, or I'll go to two books from the Old Testament, and I'll give a couple examples from the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, we already talked about Job, this idea of, the sons of God come before God and they present themselves, and then there's this dialogue that comes up before God and Job, and God actually starts things. God says like, look at Job, he's pretty great, I really like him. And then Satan accuses him and says he only loves you because of X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. And so this is an instance in which we have a human being being accused in the divine council. And I would actually say God's being accused as well, because Satan's saying, God, you don't know what you're talking about, but set that aside. And this is a theme that comes out actually a lot throughout Job. So in Job 5:1, we're told, I think it's Job is asked by one of his friends, is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? So there's this idea that, find a holy one, turn to him, get him to plead your cause, right? This pops up a couple times. So Job 16:19, even this is, I believe, Job speaking. He says, even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. And what's really funny about this, I mean, funny in kind of an ironic way, is Job thinks like he's being accused by God and he needs a witness to go before God and like, plead on his behalf. But it's really God is his witness, right? Like God is the one defending him on heaven. So it's like fun little side note there. Job 19:25, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. There's a lot that could be said here. The language of redemption is used in the Old Testament for someone who, at least in sometimes, defends someone by way of legal argument. And then this is the final example I'll give from Job. So this is Job 33, 23 through 26. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the thousand, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him, and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then man prays to God, and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. So the idea there is man finding an angel, finding a mediator, one of these, holy ones, to kind of intercede and declare what's right for him. This type of idea. Okay. So that's Job, accusation, intercession language. Let me go to one other in the Old Testament before I bring it to the New Testament. So in Zechariah 3. We're given this kind of heavenly scene in which the angel of the Lord intercedes for Joshua the high priest. So we read, I forgot what verse this is. I'm just going to say Zechariah 3. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to him he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments. And the angel of the Lord was standing by, and the angel of the Lord solemnly assured Joshua, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, then you shall rule my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you the right of access among those who are standing here." I really, we get on a whole sidetrack about that last little section. He's going to give Joshua right of access in the divine council. There's a lot to flesh out there. We're going to have to move past. Okay, so in the Old Testament, we get this idea of accusation, advocacy, divine counsel, right? Now, we get that also in several sections in the New Testament. I'm just going to give you, I'll give you maybe two or three. I'll give you maybe three because these are pretty short, except for the first one, which is going to be about a paragraph. So in Revelations 12, 7 through 11, we are told, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death." Okay, so in this, Satan, this cosmic baddie, he had this position day and night. He stood before God accusing us, and now he's been cast out. He's been disbarred, right? He's been disbarred through the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So here we get imagery associated with atonement that has to do with this idea of something going on in this divine council. In Romans 8:33 through 34, Paul says, "Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us." So this is really interesting because we get here the idea that we're able to be saved. The reason no charge can be brought against us is because Christ rose from the dead and is interceding for us. And then the final example I'll give here of New Testament stuff is, of course, Hebrews. So this is one of my go-to verses. It's talking about Jesus. It's talking about him being a high priest. And we're told he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And then it goes on, "For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, so on and so forth." The idea in 25 is, he's always lives to make intercession for us, and that's why we can be saved to the uttermost. So I'm hoping for the audience, I'm piquing I'm getting their juices flowing, and in some way think like, oh, maybe this divine counsel stuff that I saw in Kings and seemed like, oh, that's interesting, but maybe that language, if we're paying attention, we can pick up those themes and that language in the New Testament. And the way I kind of cash this out, I'll bring this to a close. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. The way I'll bring this to a close is, I see Christ, what he does, as we and maybe even God had accusations brought against us in heaven. We had someone slandering us, accusing us, and through that, using that accusation, using that slander to keep us in slavery and keep us in oppression to Satan and the cosmic powers. What Jesus does is, after his death and after his resurrection, he walks into the heavenly throne room as our defense attorney. He walks in as our defense attorney, as our advocate, and he slams, right? He destroys the case that's being brought against us. He refutes it, and through that, it is such a devastating refutation that the prosecuting attorney, Satan, who is the one accusing us, he's cast out of court. Like there's just no shot your case is ever going to come back from this, right? And that's the language we get in Revelation 12. So that's the idea. That's the core idea I'm arguing for in Devil's Disbarment, is that this incorporates what Jesus does after his this incorporates the idea of what Jesus does after his death. This is incorporates, Jesus, what he does with his death, and you can press me on that in a second, as I suspect you might want to. And yeah, okay, I'll conclude it there. I know that was a lot.
No, so what I love about your answer in the book itself too is the fact that you really do take all of the biblical data into account. You're, a lot of the different atonement theories, like you said, they kind of take one little bit of what Jesus is doing, and then they kind of ignore everything else. Like you said, Christus Victor. It's all about destroying Satan, overcoming the cosmic baddies, and I think that's exactly right. That's a part of the atonement, and like that, there's clearly themes of that in the Bible. But then, like you said, there is this idea of intercession afterwards, and it says that that's what allows us to be saved. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest flaws of the penal substitution model, is that it mostly focuses on what Jesus did in his death, and there's not much about what happens afterwards. Or there's also no explanation for this accusation advocacy motif. So I think that what your theory does is it takes everything into account. There is this accusation, there is the advocacy, there is Jesus dying, rising from the dead, and then advocating for us, and then ultimately destroying the case. And I think that if I remember right, the idea is that Satan proved himself to be the wicked ruler. He proved himself to be the one who is actually not a good ruler, because the seed of the serpent, right? The children of Satan, the enemies of God, they killed Jesus. Like God in the flesh came down into the world, and they killed him. And so that like demonstrates that it's actually Satan who is the wicked ruler and not Yahweh. And do you have any more other ideas of why his case is destroyed?
Yeah, so I have two kind of broad strands of thought. And in some sense they're separate, but in some sense I think they're intertwined. And this is something I've been talking with Adam about. So on one hand, let's go with the strand that you just touched on. On one hand, so there's this idea in Scripture of our sins are what gives Satan grounds to accuse us. It's our sins that make us subject to slavery, death, and so on and so forth. But Jesus didn't sin. And in fact, when I think it's in John, when Satan is coming to bring people to kill Jesus, Jesus says something like, "The ruler of this world is coming, but he has no claim on me." Right. So this idea of like Satan's about to lay claim to something that's not rightfully his. He's about to try to bring into his dominion something that, in this kind of divine legislative system, should be off bounds. And so Satan and the cosmic baddies, they kill Jesus. Jesus is dead. Well, now in that instance, all right, Jesus goes into the heavens, right? And so he goes in there, we're told in Hebrews, with his own blood. I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture here, right? So Jesus goes in, he's in the divine council, right? And he has his blood, he has his life, and he's throwing it down. He's literally sprinkling his blood. He's throwing it out before the heavenly beings, right? So and imagine just dead silence as this happened. He's throwing his blood out on the ground in front of these divine beings, and they are looking at Jesus's blood, right? And there's this idea in Scripture that the life is in the blood, right? So they're in a sense looking at the life of Christ, a perfect life, a sinless life, and they're seeing it there, right? And so Jesus can just point at it and be like, this is the evidence, exhibit A, right? Of this ruler, this accuser who's been coming against God. He can point to this as evidence of him going past the bounds that he was given, or his corruption, his evilness, whatever. So there's an idea here in our own legal system, right? If a prosecutor, let's say you have some prosecutor, some DA, something like that, and they have been bringing cases against people, and then they've shown to be corrupt, they've been shown to engage in something that is improper. When that happens, not only do they get cast out, not only can they lose their license, get disbarred, something like that, the previous cases that they've tried can be overruled. Those can be brought back into question because the prosecutor who was bringing them, he already showed he was corrupt. So on one hand, there's this idea here of Jesus being killed by Satan is ultimate evidence against Satan. It's evidence against his character, his accusations, stuff like that. I play with the idea in the book that when God gives dominion or gives evidence to say, or gives authority to Satan, that he, in that he kind of bakes in certain win conditions for himself. Maybe they're like really extreme maybe it's something like, okay, listen, anyone who sins against me, anyone who wants to follow you, they're yours. You can have them. They're your domain. I almost said, but so help me God, Satan. But this is God talking. So, but so help me, Satan. Like if I find out that you have ever laid claim to a soul that is not rightfully yours, if you ever try to come after my sheep, if you ever take one of my sheep for your own, I will take every soul you've ever plundered. You can have those who follow you, but if you ever take one of my own, I will cast you out of this assembly, and you will never set foot in here. Like that type. Like, so there's a kind of a baked in win condition. And the idea I give in the book is, listen, if God has stacked the deck, in which maybe in the divine council you're like, oh, God seems to have stacked the deck in Satan's favor. It seems like he gave him a lot of leeway. Satan might be like, bet, like, let's go. Like, okay, like I can work within these parameters. So it may be that there's a baked in win condition. It may be something like that win condition wasn't there, but just the evidence that comes from Jesus. God is like, okay, at this point, this is such strong evidence. Nothing reasonable can come about from this point on. So this is where the defense is going to rest its case, so to speak, and now people have to make their decisions from there. So there's that idea, right? It's okay, as evidence of Satan's malconduct, whatever. But then there's another line of thought, and which one of these is more important? It may be what day you ask me. Like, I think the second line of thought is actually more important, right? When Jesus goes into heaven, right? So he goes into heaven, he resurrects, cool. He ascends to the Father, and that's when he takes his blood and he offers it to the Father. So I have a video on my YouTube. If you're like, this is bonkers, I have a video on my YouTube called something like, did Jesus offer himself as a sacrifice on earth or in heaven, or something like that? Or where did Jesus offer himself as a sacrifice? Basically Leviticus and also Hebrews, I think, demands that we take seriously that the place where Jesus offered himself as a sacrifice is in heaven after his death. He died, he was killed here, but where he offered himself, because offering is a giving of a gift, it's giving something to the king, the deity, whatever, that happens in heaven afterwards. So
can you explain really quick
Mhm.
the parallel? Because a lot of people might be like, how did Jesus offer himself in heaven? But this is actually what it was like in Leviticus. Like, the killing of the animal wasn't the full offering. Could you explain like how this kind of works as a parallel?
Yeah, that's good that you brought that up, because some people might be ready to be like, all right, it's red X time. It's time to
Yeah.
go to something else. Okay, so I'm Joe Israelite, right? Maybe I'm Joe Israelite. Maybe I'm a high priest Israelite, whatever. Okay, I got to offer a sacrifice. Maybe I touched a dead body. Maybe it's Yom Kippur time. Whatever. I've got to offer a sacrifice. Okay, so I've got my whatever. I got my bull, and I come to the designated place. I think it's in the courtyard where things get killed. So I got my bull, I got my knife, I take my hand, lay it on the head, and okay, animal's dead. So on and so forth. And it's bleeding out, and I'm like, all right, I'm there looking at my now dead animal. This is my question to people. Have I now, at this point, have I offered a sacrifice to Yahweh? No, all I've done is kill an animal, right? In order to offer that, in order to offer that to Yahweh, I have to take the blood that I was just taken, and I have to go do something with it, right? On Yom Kippur, it is sprinkled on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, which I say is at the foot of God. I talk about that in my book. On just a normal day, if you're like Joe Israelite or whatever, it's taken to I think it's the burnt offering, the like the altar where the fire is. It's taken there, to the fire or whatever. Sounds very academic-y, the fire or whatever. It's been a while since I've read that section. I forgot how it's described. But basically, where it gets taken is dependent on who's making the offering, what the reason are, what day it is, stuff like that. So sometimes it's taken just to the kind of altar that's out front. Sometimes it's taken into the holy place, and sometimes only on Yom Kippur it's taken into the most holy place, and there it's sprinkled on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. We'll just go with that because it's the easiest. So the blood is taken in, and it is sprinkled on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, right? So it's the life. The life is in the blood. Okay, so the priest took that life, What did he do with that life? He took that life, and where did he place that life? He placed that life at the feet of Yahweh. What does this seem like? It seems like there's a giving that's being given going on here, right? It's a gift, and there's language in the Old Testament and New Testament that connects this idea of gifts and sacrifices. So, okay, so in the Old Testament system, when an animal dies, that's not when it's offered, right? It's offered when the priest takes the blood to the proper place and does what's called the blood manipulation. Sounds kind of weird, like, oh, I'm manipulating blood. What is this? Like this, like literally, like I'm manipulating my phone right now. Like think of manipulation that way. You do the certain thing that you're supposed to do with the blood. That's when it was offered, right? Or another way to think about it is like I go to Walmart and I buy a gift for my wife. All right, I buy, I don't know, like a box of chocolates or something, and I'm standing in the Walmart parking lot. I'm holding a box of chocolates. Have I given my wife a gift yet? No. Like you have to actually go take it to her, right? So then similarly, the idea in Hebrews, and this is throughout the book of Hebrews, but it becomes really strong in Hebrews 9. A parallel is being drawn because just as we had a high priest in the Levitical system who, killed an animal, took it into the most holies, so similarly we have a high priest in heaven who he passes through the heavens and he appears before God on our behalf to offer one final sacrifice. And so the idea there is just as in the Levitical system, the animal has to be killed and then taken into the most holy place. So in heaven, Jesus as a sacrifice, he was killed, but then his blood is taken not by some separate high priest, but by himself, because he's the high priest. He takes his own blood into heaven. And there he offers it as his final perfect sacrifice. Okay, so with that back, is that good? Do you feel like it's been clarified? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And I also think this, just one little clarifying note as well too. This is, I think, why one important aspect of Jesus being God too, because it's like he's going into the holy of holies, the very presence of God in heaven, and offering the blood there. So he, like, on the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament, only the high priest could go in there one day a year, and he had to do all kinds of cleansing rituals before he could go, and he had to wear a specific outfit and like do all these different things. And so for Jesus to just walk in, to the heavens, I think it just shows how holy he is, right? So,
Yeah,
anyways, continue.
I'll make a side remark here. I think it was my professor who was, or my like faculty mentor who was working with me for some of this atonement stuff. I think it was he who would say, and remember that Yom Kippur is it's the only day where an image of Yahweh was found in the temple, right? It's only that day when the high priest goes in because, man, we are the, image of God. So anyways, so, okay. So with that in mind, so if when Jesus resurrects, he goes to heaven and he's offering himself to the Father. Now, in that instance, Jesus has lived a sinless, perfect life. He's standing before Yahweh, perfect. Like he's in his resurrected body, and he's offering himself to the Father. He's offering perfect, obedient humanity back to God, right? So he's taking perfect, obedient humanity, and he's giving it to God. That's the opposite of what Adam does in the garden. Remember, because in the garden, God says one thing, Satan says another, and Adam chooses to give his allegiance to Satan. Adam chooses to believe and to follow Satan instead of God, right? And because of that, and this is something I talk about in my book, because of that, for some reason, that is what creates this disconnect, right? The disobedience of one man is what leads to Satan being able to bring this case against humankind, against God, right? So the question I float in my book, listen, if the one disobedience of Adam, if that's enough for either Satan to get this case started, if that's enough to get this disconnect here, then why can't the one obedience of one perfect man back to Yahweh, why can't that defeat the case, right? So and so there's several ideas we could play with here. We could play with the idea of maybe this is win conditions that are set up, right? Maybe when this situation gets set up, there are those win conditions that are baked in that have to happen, or maybe it's just the whatever evidential force came from the disobedience of Adam, and how Satan used that disobedience in his argument. And I have that little section in the book where I kind of I pretend what Satan might say, and I'm going to tell you I felt really dirty writing that. I'm just going to tell you, like, as someone who's read the book, like, it felt really weird. They were like, oh, I don't know if I should put that. So anyways, if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. I kind of give like a paragraph of like I pretend to be Satan, and I'm like, this maybe is what he was saying against God and how he used Adam's disobedience in his argument. And so they kind of have this other line of thought. So one line of thought is Satan showed himself to be corrupt, right? I'm big bad. But then I have this other line of thought of like Jesus's perfect obedience is in some way being used in his argument, or the argument against Satan, and that Jesus's perfect obedience is counteracting or undercutting whatever it is that Adam's disobedience did. And that's one of those areas. So in the beginning of this book, um, and I think these two things can be like intertwined. I don't think they're separate, but I kind of have those two different strands of this kind of rope. But in the beginning of this book, I say something like, I'm not going to give you an exact like nuts and bolts detail of exactly how this happened. I'm going to give you a general story of what I think atonement looks like and say, I think it's something like this. And so if someone's like, I don't like that part of your story, I think it's different, I'm gonna be like, cool, I might not like that part of my story either. And so like this is sincerely like an invitation for people like you and for like Adam to like engage in dialogue with me and like help flesh out and Adam's like bringing in really interesting stuff about stuff that I might have looked over or might enhance my case, things like that. And so this is one of those areas, if you're like, oh, like that kind of makes sense, but like maybe it's a little fuzzy, I'm like, yes, help. Like, help me. Like this is one of those things. When I was writing this book, I think there's a tendency, and maybe this is me just speculating, like there's a tendency maybe for scholars to want to present like a comprehensive case and want to like delve into and find every little like nook and cranny in the Bible. And there was some point when I was writing this, I like vaguely remember just being like, I could work on this for years. I just need to get out there and have like the Christian community like help this. And so yeah, that's my general idea of what it is that Jesus's death does. It's a combination of showing the corruption of Satan and the perfect obedience of Christ before God.
While you were talking as well, I was thinking, because there's this idea of advocacy and accusation. I think I was thinking about how in the very beginning of Jesus's ministry, he's tempted by Satan. So it's like Satan is trying to get him to serve him. And so I think it's interesting that, he says like, bow down to me and I'll give you all of the nations of the world. I can give it to whomever I please. He says that in Luke chapter 4. So this idea that Satan is trying to win him over, like he's trying to say, serve me, because there's this idea of everyone who sins is now a servant of Satan. They're a slave. Like in the Old Testament, the type for that is Egypt. There's the slaves of Egypt, and then they're freed by Moses. They're freed by, the messenger of Yahweh, right? And so then in the New Testament, we have Jesus, who's going to be our advocate. He's going to be the one that stands in. And Satan is basically saying, are you going to come to Egypt and be my slave, or are you going to serve Yahweh? And Jesus obviously passes the test. And, I think this is not a coincidence that this is something the gospel authors bring in at the very beginning of Jesus's ministry. It's like before he goes and does what he's about to do for us, he goes and fasts for 40 days, getting himself in a completely vulnerable state. Like he's really demonstrating, because the first thing he's tempted with is food, right? Will you turn these rocks into bread? And you have to imagine how hungry he was. And I know that your canonic theology, it's like he was really hungry. I haven't eaten today and I'm pretty hungry right now. It's like, imagine not eating for 40 days, and it's like, imagine how hungry he was and how much he wanted to turn those rocks into bread and eat them. Right. But, he overcame that challenge. And I think this also serves as evidence before the divine council. It's like exhibit A, look at Satan trying to, tempt him when he was, in the wilderness after 40 days. And, Jesus overcame that. And then Jesus kept performing miracles and spreading the kingdom of heaven. And then eventually Satan's like, all right, I'm going to kill him. Right. So,
so I was going to add on there, like sometimes, so this is something that comes up in like ransom theories where they think that like in some ransom theories, the language is almost like a chess move where they trick like Satan into blundering as their queen or whatever. And they're like, why would Satan do that? And like, if that's the case, let's say there's some win condition and like Satan like knows like this is like the win condition for Yahweh or whatever. Like, why would Satan do this? I was like, okay, first off, put yourself in. I know it sounds weird. Like, put yourself in Satan's shoes. All right, you've been building up this kingdom on earth, and right, you've been rocking out, and now this one guy is just wrecking havoc. Like he's casting out all these demons that you've gotten people. He's healing all these sick people that you've been afflicted, and he's drawing people in masses to your enemy. Like he's drawing people in mass back to the God of Israel. This one guy that you're trying to overthrow. So you're seeing your entire kingdom get destroyed. Cast out. You're the strong man who's being bound and your house plundered. As Jesus might say. Um, and you see what seems to be your enemy in a place of weakness, in a place of vulnerability. And also Satan's like he's a being who is he, he doesn't seem to be the most wise individual when it comes to the decisions he makes. He seems to be a being who is overcome with pride and being puffed up and arrogance and things along those lines. He is a being who arguably seems potentially filled with hate. Like, does it really seem that crazy that this type of guy, this type of like arrogant, this type of prideful guy who seems to be in many ways maybe just filled with hate, in this type of moment is like just not going to he's not going to lash out in this way. I think that's something worth considering. Now, you mentioned something that reminded me of, so me and Adam was talking about like like not Adam as in like biblical Adam as in like the guy we both know, Curious Christianity. He
For
was
those that
talking,
don't know, real quick, Adam, he's a friend of the channel. He runs a YouTube channel called Curious Christianity. I'll put a link to that down below too, just so everyone knows who we're talking about. It's one of our friends.
yeah. So he started more seriously thinking about the idea, and he got me thinking about this idea of Job as a typology for Christ. And then I was like bored one day, and I was like reading through like a Job commentary, and I came across something that like sparked my interest. And I'll put it here. I sent like just a little email to Adam about this, like, hey, this might be interesting. So in Job 22:21 through 30, one of Job's friends seems to hint at the idea that God will save even the guilty, and that they will be delivered through the cleanliness of Job's hand. And the clean hands, so that's in reference to Job's. And this is interesting, as it gives the faint notion. This is the faint notion from one of Job's friends, that a righteous man will be able to intercede for the wicked because of his righteousness. And it's only a passing sentence, but when I looked in the Anchor Yell commentary for this, it notes that, and I'm gonna briefly like skim through this and paraphrase the interesting bits. It notes that the idea of a righteous man or a saint had great influence with God, even to the point of nullifying a divine decree, or saving the wicked out of consideration for the righteous, is implicit in the story of Abraham's plea on behalf of Sodom. The three ancient worthies, Daniel, Noah, and Job, were apparently credited with the ability to save others through their own transcendent righteousness, and they cite Ezekiel 14:14 and 20 there. Though this notion is emphatically rejected by Ezekiel, and then this is just what Anchor Yell is saying. And then they give a couple of other instances in, I think, some Jewish literature where this idea seems to pop up. So I'll stop there. I just was like, I knew there's a few sections of interest in that Anchor Yell Bible commentary quote. But that's maybe another line that I haven't considered adequately, is maybe there's this idea of a perfectly righteous man, or even just a righteous man in general. They have the right to intercede for another in virtue of their righteousness. And then that's another line. I haven't really gone down that line of thought yet. I found that just quite recently. I don't know how much water it'll hold, but I'll give that to your audience, and they can chew on it or spit it out as they see fit.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And, Jesus does say that the scriptures testify about him, right? So it would make a lot of sense if Job is a picture of Jesus. And I think in a lot of ways he is, right? He's test my servant Job, right? He's a righteous man. And then,
Mm-hmm.
he still worships Yahweh, even though he's losing everything around him, right? And so I think that there are definitely illusions or pictures of Christ in that moment. So we've been talking about your atonement theory for a while, and there's one particular atonement theory that you don't that you do take issue with in the book, and you kind of go against it, and you say, because you mention at one point, there's one sentence where you say you could see themes of Christus Victor in this theory, you could see recapitulation a little bit in there, and then obviously now your divine counsel accusation and advocate theme there. But there's one particular theory that you take issue with, and I think it's the longest chapter in your book where you go through and argue against it, and that's penal substitutionary atonement. And I held that view for many years. I recently I first let go of it after I read Will Hess's book, Crushing the Serpent's Head, I think
Mhm.
is what it's called. He runs a channel called The Church Split, and basically read his book. I watched a couple of other videos, watched some of your content. That's actually when I found your content. I was researching the Atonement, and yeah, that's when I saw your book, and I was like, let me get that too. And so I very, very recently stopped holding the penal substitutionary atonement, probably like 4 or 5 months ago. And but in your book, you say that you also used to hold the penal substitutionary atonement. So
I was the
tell,
best. I was the best penal. I say this in jest. Like I was. Oh, I was so emphatic. Let me give you a story about how emphatic I was. So my family, my brother and my mother, um, I grew up Protestant, and my brother and my mother became Eastern Orthodox, and through that, I got to know. I visited Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm not Eastern Orthodox, but I have a family member now, just one, my brother, who is. Um, not because my mom like converted back; she passed away. Like it wasn't. She was like, "I'm Eastern Orthodox now." But like she was the Eastern Orthodox fan. Um, so I have my brother and mother and brother. They started going Eastern Orthodox, and I started visiting the churches and looking into what they said and stuff like that. And one of the attacking points for Eastern Orthodox was they kind of sometimes ripped on the idea of penal substitution. At least, they're not like super dogmatic about this, but this is kind of it seems to be something common is a rejection, at least, of the emphasis that a lot of Protestants put on it. So this is something that was like nagging at me, and at that time I was a huge William Lane Craig fanboy. I followed William Lane Craig. I started reading him when I was like in high school, which was like 2013, something like that. So I had been following him for a while. He was doing stuff on Atonement, defending PSA, and I was hanging out and talking with people in these Orthodox circles, and I was hearing stuff from my family about like bashing PSA, and like I took it upon myself to be the PSA defender, and I got into arguments with my family, and I actually that one of the head priests there. I was at the time I was in school, and I had kind of been putting off some of my concerns until I could like address them more fully. And then at a time I'm like, all right, it's time for me to like really press my objections. And so me and that priest, we had we had like a 2 week long email debate on PSA of me like arguing for PSA, and like I have the whole thing saved somewhere. I think I put it in a Word document. It's like 70 pages long of just going back and forth, and me and him are on good terms. Like he's a friend of the family. I want to make that clear. And so yeah, so I was using like William Lane Craig stuff, and so like I was dead set on this is like you just can't get away from this. Like it's there in scripture, and you can probably go back and find some old videos on my. I think there's somewhere on my TikTok or my YouTube. There was some video of me defending a PSA model, like not like against some like atheist objector or something like that. It wasn't like a huge full blown theological argument, but it was me like defending the coherence of penal substitution or against something philosophical. So yeah, I had heard Craig's stuff on it. I think he's the guy to beat nowadays. Like he's the one who's really been championing it. So I've read some of his stuff. I've read some of the other proponents, and yeah, I was really avidly into it. So I just want people to know, like, if you're like coming into this and you're just like, this guy just hasn't read enough Craig. I assure you, I know the arguments that you're going to. Like I've addressed Craig a lot. I may still be wrong, but it's not wrong because I just haven't heard the arguments. Like I looked
have you
through.
ever heard of
Yeah.
Isaiah 53?
Wait, what? Oh, I forgot that one. Yeah, like that's the
Yeah, it's
that's the
like,
go-to one.
yeah, have you ever even heard of Isaiah 53, bro? Like that's pretty much what they go to. And you do spend an extensive he gives an extensive treatment in his book. So again, the link's in the description if you want to see how to deal with Isaiah 53 as a non-penal substitutionary atonement advocate. Go read that part of his book at least, and I recommend reading the whole thing, but at least read that section. But what was the thing that ultimately led you to rejecting it? For me, I think the first thing I noticed was that the animals in the old covenant were not being punished. Like that was like the
Hmm.
first kind of red flag that ticked for me. I started seeing, okay, Jesus is fulfilling something in the Old Testament, but I would never say that if a cow or a cattle or a ram or whatever was being, offered to God, I would never say that animal was being punished for
Hmm.
when they were being offered. And so right when I noticed that, I immediately was like, okay, something is off here. And that was kind of when the cognitive dissonance starts kicking in. It's like, wait, no, it has to be there. And like, you start looking for it in the Day of Atonement or the scapegoat story and all this
Mhm.
stuff, and you start looking for it everywhere you can find it. But then eventually, I just realized it's not in the Bible, and I eventually, once I found your channel and saw some of your arguments, I was like, yeah, this is just for sure false. So, what was it that really led you to reject penal substitutionary atonement?
Yeah, what's the phrase? The stumbling block that becomes the cornerstone or whatever. That's what was the stumbling block for me that became the cornerstone of my rejection of PSA was Hebrews. I'll say like this book that I have is kind of like if I had to pick the people that really came together to influence me on this, it's going to be Mike Heiser, Divine Council stuff. Not going to be super surprising. David Moffat's book, Rethinking Atonement, really helped me situate understanding like Levitical stuff and the idea of cleansing sacred space, and how that gets picked up in Hebrews. Now, that book by Moffat, that's not a book that's focused on atonement, like theorizing as much as I do. Like I get the vibe he's coming at that more of like a biblical studies perspective. So like, whereas I'm like, I got to account for all the data. He's kind of more just like talking about Hebrews. And that's just my like personal opinion there. If Moffat, if you're watching this, like, don't sue me if that's wrong. But so yeah, so he was trying to like him explaining stuff in Hebrews, and then finally John Peckham, especially John Peckham's book Theodicy of Love, where he like really I feel like got my mind thinking along this kind of like great controversy line of thought and this type of like rules of engagement. And I was already on this kind of cosmic conflict bandwagon from Heiser, but Peckham just took it up a notch, and then I took some ideas that he hinted with, and I'm like, let's just run with these, let's just flesh them out, right? And I hope maybe someone will do the same thing with my work. Take what the framework I've improved upon and improve upon it more. But yeah, Hebrews, because just and just okay, so Christ had to become like us in all respects. Why? So he could be our high priest. But him being a high priest is something he does after his death. But I thought it was all about his death. I thought that was the whole reason the Son of Man came, is because he needed to die. But this is telling me he had to become like us in order to do something after his death. And the thing he does after his death, that's the reason that I'm able to be saved. Like that was the big thing. And like I said, that was that's part of that's related to my dissertation work. Um, but I think so. Like I had that type of stuff going on. And I also had Heiser, and I think at the time maybe I had like heard or read some of his stuff or Ron Johnson stuff critiquing like a PSA understanding of Levitical sacrifice. I've worked through a good bit of Heiser's like Naked Bible podcasts and stuff like that. But really, Hebrews is where, and that's why like I've done like live streams and stuff like that where I invite people to come up and talk with me about atonement, and I'll say bodacious things. Like I'll say things like. Jesus' death wasn't enough to save you, and people are like, right, like they just like lose their minds. They're just they're a little switch in their brain. They're like picking up pitchforks and they're like, how dare you say Jesus' sacrifice wasn't enough? I'm like, I didn't say Jesus' sacrifice wasn't enough. Like, what are you talking about? Like,
Just
and
the
so
death.
then yeah, and then I'm like, oh, like, let's go look at Hebrews. I'm like, what does Hebrews 7:25 says? Oh, it's because he always lives to make intercession. That's interesting. Like that
Yeah,
type of
yeah, yeah.
stuff. And so Hebrews is the beachhead for completely destroying your PSA. If you're a PSA guy, really taking Hebrews seriously, that's what did it for me.
Yeah, and I do want to say as well, I think that this is obviously an in-house debate. I think like my editor holds the PSA, so he's going to have a fun time listening to this.
He's
So
gonna hate this.
yeah, so hi John, by the way.
Hi,
uh,
John.
we're critiquing your view. I'm sorry, but yeah, I've already told him I don't hold the PSA, so he knows this. And we disagree on a lot. And actually, in the future, we want to do live streams where we just talk through our disagreements and show people like we can be brothers in Christ and disagree. Um, so John, what's up? Love you, bro. But we disagree. Um, now, I do want to say real quick about PSA. Because I've been reliably told, James, that
Yeah.
the PSA is the gospel. And if you reject PSA, you're rejecting the gospel itself. So could you explain why we're not just like gospel denying liberals for denying PSA?
Yeah, well, if you gospel, well, someone like Alyssa Childers would call us gospel denying progressives. That's her boogeyman word. I think she would say that we're just progressive Christians. Yeah. So I've also heard the idea of like, oh, this is the heart of the gospel. I think even C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis, and I think it's Mere Christianity. He talks about atonement, and he distinguishes between the fact of the atonement and the explanation or the mechanism of the atonement. I don't remember the exact word that he used, but that's the idea. And he likens it to like nutrition. So he says like for a long time, mankind has known if you're not feeling well, if you're feeling tired, whatever, you're feeling agitated, go get yourself a good meal. You'll feel better, right? We've known that for a long time. Long before we knew about calories and proteins and carbohydrates and XYZ molecules and insulin and all that, we knew you're feeling bad, like get yourself something to eat. It's gonna if you're getting tired and lethargic and even like running 8 miles, like get yourself something to eat. And so we knew the fact of, this would do this long before we knew how. And even if, something crazy happens and we have to abandon our understanding of how it is that, eating a good meal makes you feel better, even if that all somehow goes like up in flames, which seems unlikely, but let's suppose it does. We're all still going to know that eating a good meal is going to make you feel better, right? So there's this fact of this will happen and this is, the result. And there's the explanation of it. And as Christians, we have to make sure that we distinguish between the fact of the atonement, which is the gospel, and our explanation of the atonement. So the fact of the atonement is Christians were in a, or humanity was in a pickle, and Jesus got us out of it, right? Like that is the fact of the atonement is like we had some type of issue, like humanity as a whole did. We had some type of issue. This issue was um, was problematic to us having a right relationship with God. And then because of Jesus, his work, now like that issue has been fixed and we can, have this restored and renewed relationship with God. That's the fact of the atonement. And that's what is the heart of the gospel. Everything else is just the explanation of, but how, like, but why, stuff like that. And I would point out that if you think that the PSA and the way that it's articulated nowadays is like essential to the gospel, I'm going to say there's a whole lot of really prominent Christian writers through history who apparently just didn't know what the gospel was. Like Irenaeus, like his atonement theory is kind of bonkers. Like I don't mean that's disrespectful to him. Like Irenaeus is like, yeah, like God, Jesus saves us just by being God and living a human life and just like walking through every stage of human life. I mean, like I'm massively oversimplifying that. So if someone's like a recapitulation fan, they're gonna like at me and be like, you forgot about this section of against heresy. It's like, okay, whatever. Like, but like this idea is his thing is like, oh well, like as Jesus walks through every stage of life, like he's like perfecting it and bringing it like back to God or whatever. It's like that's really weird. And then you have guys like one of the Gregories or Oregon who talk about like they use this fish hook metaphor of like Christ was like, the divine worm that was on this fish hook and it got Satan to bite and then caused Satan to vomit up all that he had, eaten. Like you just have like in the early church, you have people who were like, I'm not saying they're not, I don't think they're idiots. They're just doing what we're doing. They were doing what we're doing, but they're trying to figure out like what's going on here. How does this work? And they're like playing with different ideas and, or is this a ransom offer to God? Is this a ransom offer to Satan? And so I'm like, unless you just want to like brand a whole slew of like church history as just like they just didn't know what the gospel was. And like I would probably say like the earliest, like there were some PSA people or anti-PSA people who are like this doesn't show up in Christian thought until like 15th century with Anselm or something. I don't even remember if that date is right, but you know what I mean. They like it's way later.
Mhm.
It's way later until like Protestant times, where this medieval times. Like that's when I'm not gonna say that. I think there's stuff in earlier fathers. I think there's stuff pre 1000 AD that sure does sound like penal substitution. But I'm gonna say like if we go back to like within 200 years or so, I'm really interested in like pre-Nicene Christianity right now for even some other projects I'm working on. Like I don't know, it seems like it's really focused on Christus Victor and ransom and stuff like that. So I would just be like, don't confuse the explanation of atonement with the fact of the atonement, and recognize that this has been an area where Christians have differed on for like going on going on a long time now, right? Like thousands of years at least. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's kind of helping us understand the atonement too is like Old Testament scholarship, like understanding how the ancient world worked. So I think that that's one blessing we have that maybe Irenaeus and Origen and all those guys didn't have is that they probably didn't have a in-depth understanding of ancient Judaism. And so like we're connecting all these themes from the Old Testament and then, bringing it into continuity with the New Testament and trying to fit all these themes together. And so I think that, um, like I said earlier in the conversation, that was probably my favorite part of your book was that it took all these themes together and made it like fit into one theory. And so,
So
yeah, I
yeah,
think that
yeah.
yeah.
I had a thought. So I said it's been thousands of years, but technically it's not quite 2,000 years that we've been hashing this out as Christians, right? So what if by the 2,000 mark we just get everybody to agree on divine counsel? What if that's the big 2,000 mark? We can just collectively as a society. Let's hope for it.
I think that would be nice, you
That's
know.
yeah. Sorry, that's a stupid joke on my part, but you actually being sincere and actually expressing good ideas. No, yeah, yeah, there's the I'm not gonna go on like a whole thing about like like against the church fathers and stuff right now, but something you noted, which I do want to like affirm, is we have access to so many text and so much like data from the ancient Near East that like even what we would consider like early church fathers, maybe like between like 400 to 1,000, like they don't I don't think they had access to. And so yeah, like our understanding of certain things in the ancient Near East is in some ways exponentially, I would probably argue, higher than some of these people that people want to go to. And I've had people be like, well, Aquinas said this, and you're not as good as Aquinas. Like, cool. Aquinas didn't have the thousands of lines of, like Ugaritic text or whatever that we have. Like, his opinion on this doesn't like combat, what we're learning from, I think, great scholarship like Heiser and Moffat and these people who are doing that stuff. So I heard you mention that, and I just want to affirm like there can be this tendency, and I just kind of low key expressed it myself, like, well, I want to go back and I want to get earlier because the earlier it is, the closer to truth it is. But like that doesn't like if earlier is like still 300 years after like when Jesus lived, and Jesus living is still like hundreds, if not over 1,000 years after when this Old Testament stuff was going on, like that's still a huge chunk of time. That's still like a huge cultural gap. And so, because sometimes people might be inclined to think like, hey, James, where's your view in the fathers? You're just popping up with this, like novel view. And of course, I'm kind of like, it's not like completely novel. It's more like I'm taking stuff that's out there and I'm like, I think I joke at one point of like, yeah, it's a little bit of Christus Victor, a little bit of recapitulation, a little bit of ransom, like sprinkle some stuff in there and sprinkle a little divine counsel in there, something like that. Yeah, so it's not explicitly stated in the fathers, but it tracks on stuff that they are thinking about, and it does so by bringing in aspects of the Old Testament and New Testament and divine counsel.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say is that I think it's just a complete red herring too, like or a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that let's just even say it's completely new, no one's thought of it before. Does that make it false? Obviously not. But also, I think that what your view is kind of getting at is older. The divine counsel view is something that's kind of been lost. So you can almost look at it as a retrieval effort, right? Where you're going back into ancient Israel and saying, how did they view, metaphysics? How did they view, the profane versus the holy and all these different things, right? And we should take their metaphysics into account whenever we're doing biblical theology. And if we're not doing that, if we're rather taking like Aristotelian metaphysics and doing theology that way, it's like, which one's going to be better? Are we going like I would prefer to get my metaphysics from ancient Israel rather than Aristotle. So
We sound so Protestant right now. We have to go back. We have to reclaim. We have to reform. But it's like, I mean, I'm on board. I just think it's someone who's like Catholic Orthodox is just listening to this. It's just shaking
they're
their
like
head. Like we sound super
the
Protestant right now.
the fathers, I don't want to, chide them for that. I respect their desire to have tradition, and I respect the
Mhm.
Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, even though I myself am not either one, and I do have my disagreements, and I have debated with Catholics in the past and stuff. I think that at the same time, though, we should try our best to get at truth, and we shouldn't be afraid
Mhm.
of truth. And if this view is correct, even if we granted, even if I said it's completely new, no one's ever thought of this before, it doesn't make it false. Let's look at the data. Let's let the argument stand on its own merits, and let's see what the Bible teaches ultimately. And that's to me what matters most. And I think Catholic and Eastern Orthodox can get on board with that. If the Bible teaches this view, then we should believe it, no matter who believed it before. Now, to wrap this up, I have, like maybe two more questions. The first one is, in the last chapter of your book, you kind of go over some practical reasons to accept your view over like a penal substitution model. And you
Mhm.
kind of say that this can help us in our apologetics. So, what is, in your mind, some of the biggest benefits of adopting a view like this as opposed to like PSA or something like that.
Yeah. And I want to be clear in that final chapter. I'm not like, hey, you should hold to my model because of these things. I'm like, no, you've already decided to buy it. Here's me helping you get your new worldview set up. Right? That's kind of the idea. So I think a big pragmatic benefit is so like I mentioned that a lot of my TikTok stuff was responding to objections to Christianity, and a lot of objections to Christianity come from penal substitution. People are like, why can't? So, for instance, Muslims will be like, why can't God just forgive? Like, He just forgives in Islam. Like, like that's a reasonable question. Now, whether or not you think, like, I know the typical like PSA response is to say like, oh, well, God's perfect justice demands that He, not forgive, and then there's kind of a line of thought there. But or so you have people like that, or you have people being like, is like, how is this just? Like God is so just, He can't just forgive me, but He's not just enough to care about who He's punishing. Like, there's some weird philosophical things that come about. Um, like I think there
Or
are
like he's
objections.
so
Yeah,
just he has to punish a perfectly innocent man, or he's or
yeah,
like he has to another one is he has to save us by punishing himself to save us from himself, or things like that.
yeah. And so I think the reason I say this is like, listen, there's just kind of some, I think there are some type of weird maneuvers you have to do philosophically. So like I attack PSA almost exclusively from biblical grounds in my book, because I knew when I was a PSA advocate, you could come at me with all the philosophical firepower you wanted. I wasn't going to budge because I thought it was biblical. So that's my main beachhead. But I want to point out to people, and I do this in the last chapter of my book. I think just apologetics become a lot easier once you abandon PSA and once you get something like divine counsel, because then it's not like, okay, God just had to punish somebody and He's apparently going to pour all that out on an innocent man, and get into issues about, is that just, so on and so forth. You're not going to get into that stuff. You're not going to get into, well, like, listen, why should we think that forgiving someone is something that's unjust? Here's a fun one. Like, I'm supposed to forgive people, right? I'm supposed to just like not hold people's debts against them. But PSA is telling me that God doesn't even hold Himself to the same standard He's giving me. Like, I'm supposed to, forgive, 70 times 7 or whatever it is. But God doesn't do that, because God's like this scrupulous, like, debt keeper who's always got to make sure like the books are balanced. So you have to do like some kind of, I think, contrived, you have to do some backflips. You have to do some maneuvers to respond to objections to PSA that I just think are simpler when it comes to divine counsel stuff. And then I think the other thing I outline in my book, or I can kind of give as, here's a fun little new trick you have with your new atonement theory, is I think the stuff that I put forward for this in a, it contributes a lot to conversations about the problem of evil and suffering. Because like, why evil? Why are things bad? And the response that someone like me is going to give, or someone like John Peckham's going to give, is like, well, there's this cosmic conflict. Like, we we experience life like is like this battlefield, because the universe is this battlefield. And I go into more in depth in the book. I'm not going to like get super into it here. But I think that a lot of the stuff that I set up in the book to explain atonement, I think you can really easily, and like, I appreciate your feedback here, because admittedly I don't spend much time on that on the book. I market this book as like an atonement book. That's how I describe it. But I'd be interested to see how your thoughts are on in that section where I pivot and say, let's cash this out in problem of evil stuff. To put it simply, I'd say, oh, listen, this framework that I've built for you, or that we've built together for atonement stuff, and explaining it as like why Satan was allowed to have power, why this needed to happen. I say you can pretty easily move that into explaining just in general, why is there suffering? When in general, why do these bad beings have power? Why doesn't God, step in and stop this type of stuff? And so I think that's probably the two big things, just going off the top of my head, is it makes apologetic situations where people, they attack the gospel. What they're really attacking is PSA, and you can be like, I think that's whack too. Like, like, you can just move on to the next issue. You don't have to do those type of backflips. And then I think it gets you a good bit of the ways to something really useful when it comes to problem of evil discourse. I think that's probably the big things.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion on the problem of evil because it has a lot of explanatory power. I mean, when you think of, like, look around, there's lots of evil people in the world, there's lots of wickedness in the world, and then when you think of it, in the immaterial realm around us that we can't see, touch, taste, measure, etc., there's a cosmic conflict going on. There are these Elohim that are wicked, and they are using their free will to do what they do, and then there's the angelic Elohim, and they're doing what they do, and it looks a lot like what happens in the physical world, where you have people that are going against evil and they're trying to fight against it, and they're standing up for good causes, and then you have people that are advocating those horrible causes, or they're inflicting horrible harm on people, or they're enslaving people, or whatever. And so to me, it kind of flows well with the physical realm and the immaterial realm. They're like kind of doing similar things, and I think it has a lot of explanatory power. And so when I kind of was reading through that section of the book, I remember being like, yeah, that does make a lot of sense of what I see around me. That there are these wicked Elohim that are waging war on the kingdom of heaven, and they're the seed of the serpent and the seed of Satan. They are the ones that follow them, right? They're the ones that serve him. And so those are my thoughts on that section, just off the top of my head.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, like something that John Peckham says, and like there's a tendency when it comes to problem of evil stuff to want to baptize every evil. And one of the things I like that Peckham says, and I'm on board with this, and I kind of hate myself because I didn't. There were some things, I'll mention another one that I didn't put in my book, and I'm like, did I just forget to put that in there? Is like when Jesus is confronted with the problem of evil in the parable of the sower and the seed, like, oh, like the farmer sows good seed, and in the night his enemy comes and sows bad seed, and then later weeds grow up. Um when the tenants come and they ask the master, is like, didn't you sow good seeds? Why are there all these weeds? You know what the response is? He isn't like, yes, well, the weeds actually help the crop grow better, or something like that. The response is, an enemy did this. Like, it is like he isn't trying to baptize like how the weeds actually are like a good thing. He's just like, no, an enemy did this. And so sometimes there's a tendency to want to, like, with some theodicies, to say every single thing is for your betterment. And that can, like, I have uncomfort with like telling a woman who like just lost a child, who was like, I'm gonna not say things that are gonna like affect your like ability to air this on YouTube. But like, imagine something really gruesome. Imagine a mother just loses her child and be like, oh, well, actually, like, that was actually a good thing. It's like, no, like, let's just call evil evil. Like, we don't have to baptize this. We can say an enemy did this. Something I'm
Yeah.
gonna add, as far as like a benefit. So all this conversation about what it is, how it is that Jesus saves us, and maybe that you could probably justifiably rebuke me for this, of like, I just, in like the last part of the last chapter, I like very briefly tie this in to our future and our destiny as humans, and kind of me being influenced by Heiser. What I say is, like, listen, this divine council stuff and these people standing before God, like, that's what we get to become. Like, we get to enter into those roles. This is kind of the Orthodox view of theosis, and I give some scriptures for that. And I say, like, listen, I think about what the angel of the Lord, I think it was, that told Joshua, like, I will give you right of access here. Like, I will replace your filthy garment. There's this idea that we get to enter into in some way, like this divine council, this kind of family. And to me, that has really big significance. And you could write a whole book just on that idea, and like piecing stuff together for that. Something I didn't talk about in my book, which is kind of just stupid on my part, because I did a presentation on it. When I was working on this atonement stuff, I gave a presentation in my doctoral program, and you can find that presentation on my YouTube. I actually brought this up. It's called "Do Christians Teach Rulers in Heaven According to Paul?" Yes, right? That's the name of this video. I take this idea that we've been talking about, but I instead of it being about atonement, instead of it being about problem of evil, I cash it out in terms of worship. Like, when you go to church and you worship God, like, what's going on? Like, what are you doing there? And I think that this divine atonement, or this divine council atonement stuff, and just divine council in general, this has shifted and altered stuff that's in my mind when I worship. Like, when I go to a church and like there's a worship service going on, the things that come to my mind, the images that come to my mind, like the hymns that I sing and I praise, they hit different because of the worldview that I have now of this divine council and how I see God and stuff like that. And I think the function that the church plays. I'm just going to give a teaser. Just people go watch that video that I just referenced. I think I think it'll open up maybe a benefit of this that you wouldn't have considered. And at the time, I was taking an ecclesiology course. I'm like, I'm doing this research on atonement. How can I shoehorn this in and make my research relevant to this? I'm lazy. Like, how can I make this fit? But I think the stuff I get in there is really significant. And so yeah, so I think it has impacts on how we worship. And I'll just be lazy and say, go check out my video on that.
No, that's really cool. And I actually totally agree. Whenever you view God as someone who was just willing to go to any length to reconcile us to himself and to win us back from the wickedness and the demons and Satan and the forces of darkness, and he totally overthrew Satan's case and said, "You have no case. You're a liar." And John 8 says he's the father of lies and all these things, and he has no case. And so now we can simply come to Christ and give him our allegiance and our faith and just commit our lives to him and worship him. And so it's very, very cool. Well, Dr. Agnew, I am sure we have made it exactly 0 people mad in this interview. No one is going to be upset. Everyone's super happy. But is there anything else that you want to say? Where can people find you? Is there anything else you're working on that you want people to point to? And or if there's any loose ends you want to tie up here at the end, feel free.
Yeah, we know we've made at least John mad, right?
Yeah, right.
We've got at least one person. I don't say this stuff to make people mad, just so people know. I don't wake up in the morning and I'm just like, how can I make people mad today? It just comes naturally. Okay, so wrapping things up. So yeah, I have a YouTube called In Philosopher's Garb. Most of the stuff I'm putting out on it right now has been more theology stuff. I'm like starting to work on a project that maybe gets more back to my roots, but or at least the stuff I was doing. I don't know what my roots are. I mean, I feel like in some sense philosophy are kind of where this all began. Like I bash Craig, but like he was a huge influence on me in high school, getting into like philosophy or religion and stuff like that. So anyways, I am getting back to some stuff that maybe you would consider more mere Christianity stuff or less controversial. Like this is really controversial. My stuff on kind of Christology is really controversial. I'm working on some projects that probably won't be done for a while, but are going to get maybe more like general Christian population will like me for it. But yeah, so you can find me on In Philosopher's Garb, and I put out stuff on there. And I don't have a posting schedule. I just do stuff. It just happens when it happens. So yeah, so check out my YouTube, see if there's stuff there you like. The book that we've been talking about in this video, by the time you are seeing this, it should be free. The ebook should be free. If you want a print copy, you can buy the print copy, like whatever. I will take your money. I will appreciate it. Amazon will take your money. But if you prefer ebook or you don't have the funds, then you're more than welcome to. Like I said, it should be available on Amazon as ebook for free right now. So hopefully that won't be a barrier. And if for some reason you're not able to access it through Amazon, because I've had people be like, it's not available in my region. It should also be available on Google Play. So try that. You should be able to get the ebook there. And if you still can't find it, just email me at infilosophersgarb@gmail.com, and I'll send you like a PDF copy of the book. So yeah, so the book should be free. My other book on canonic Christology, ebook's also free. So if that sounded interesting to you, check it out. And yeah, thank you, Nathan, for having me on. I think that's all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Agnew. This has been really, really fun. Like I said, I've been watching your content. I binged it for a while, and now I've pretty much caught up on everything. So now I just kind of wait for you to upload. But so this
Sorry, cool. You're gonna wait a while, right?
No, actually, I just watched your video response to Randall the other day, and then have you come out with one since then? Yeah, you did. But it was your interview with Adam, which I already saw on his channel. But yeah. Really great stuff. Again, I'll put links in the description below to all the relevant links, and even to Adam's channel, since we mentioned him a bunch of times. So go check him out too. And do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and we will see you guys in the next one.